Hi, and welcome to this short lesson that I've decided to call Norway Emerges 1870 to 1914. I call it Norway Emerges because this is the era when Norway really starts to step out onto the world stage and, most importantly, gains its independence from Sweden and finally becomes its own independent country in 1905. So there are three things we're going to talk about in this lesson: industrialization, the emergence of democracy, and the independence movement in 1905 when Norway became independent from Sweden, which after all the fireworks of 1814, 1905 is kind of a non-event, but we'll see that a little later. First of all, let's talk about some trends that were going on here in Norway at the end of the 19th century that actually speed up at the end of the 19th century for reasons that we're actually going to get to in the next lesson, which is about Norway before World War I. I'll give you a little hint. There was a giant arms race going on in Europe between the great powers of Europe, and they required a tremendous amount of industrial materials to start building up their armed forces. We'll talk about that in the next lesson and the build-up to World War I. But because Europe needs a lot of raw materials, Norway industrializes even more than they had in the early part of the 19th century. It really gets going now in 1870. These are the industries that became very important here in Norway. I'm not going to read through them because we're going to go through them here very quickly. We know that Norway has always had a lot of iron and metals. There are a couple of industries that start up in the north at Kirkenes. This is a mining company that begins to bring very high-grade iron ore down out of a mine in Sweden. You need very high-grade iron ore to make very hard steel, and hard steel is important if you're going to build railroad rails, if you're going to build cannons, and very high-grade industrial materials. So you need really good iron and steel, and that was coming out of Kirkenes. Here in the south, because we had a lot of cheap hydroelectricity, which we're going to get to in just a minute, we saw this guy on our tour in Arendal. He's from Arendal. His name is Sam Ida, and he started a little company that we may even recognize today. The company was called Elkem. Originally, Elkem now makes highly refined silicium for solar cells, but its original production was in aluminum, and aluminum needs a lot of electricity. And what did we have a lot of here in the South? Electricity, which we will get to in just a little bit. So Sam Ida is making aluminum here in the South. We've already seen this industry before. We know in Mosbu, Hoya, which is where they started, they actually had fabrics all over, or factories all over Norway. They were making textiles. They made home textiles, sheets and blankets, and I think they made cotton things for underwear, which was important. But if you're going to have a sailing ship, you have to have sails. And if you're going to have sails, you have to have large pieces of textiles. So that goes hand in hand with what we're going to talk about in just about one more slide. Shipbuilding required large amounts of textiles also. I don't know if Mosbu made those, but they did make a lot of textiles for ships here in Norway. Why did you need the ships? We needed the ships because there were a lot of herring and fishing off the west coast of Norway, particularly herring in the area around Stavanger. And then as you go farther north toward the Lofoten, you know that there was a lot of fishing. And even around the corner, clear up to Kirkenes, there was a lot of fish factories, canning factories. That continues to expand. I'm not going to stop and talk about shipbuilding right now, but you know already that Arendal, Lillesand were very big in shipbuilding. There were at times the ability just in Lillesand, they could build 40 ships all at the same time. Remember also that's all going great guns in Arendal until 1886 when the bank collapses, which we've talked about before. And that bank collapse causes the shipping industry in southern Norway to collapse. So shipping is going to be important in the 1870s, but by the middle of the 1880s, it's going to kind of fade away. All right. Also, in the world, because there were now big industrial printing presses, those printing presses required a lot of paper. Now, paper is made from trees. And where are the biggest forests in Norway? Up in Nord-Trøndelag. So in Trondheim in particular, there was a big paper factory. And if you go north of Trondheim up towards Steinkjer, there are great big paper factories up there still today. So forestry products, including the timber used to build ships, become very important. Finally, we're going to talk about hydroelectricity and what happened here at the end of the 1890s. It happened here in Kristiansand, but it also happened in a town I used to live in, Namsos. Namsos, like Kristiansand, burned to the ground in the 1890s. And the English insurance companies that had the contracts to insure these towns said, no more wooden buildings, and if you build in wood, you have to have fire suppression systems. So they went up into these, if you look above Namsos here to the north of Namsos, see all those little lakes up there? Some of them are Paternoster lakes, but straight north of Namsos there's Havikvatnet. They dammed that up, and they used the water that came out of that to as fire control in the cities, high pressure water that they used to squirt on the fires. They did the same thing here. We'll get to that in just a minute. And some smart guy said, if you have a dam and water's running over the top of it, why don't we put a turbine underneath that water and catch the water as it flows through the turbine and make electricity? So Namsos was the first town in Europe to have town power. They had their own hydroelectric power, and they were the first electrified city in Europe. Now, that also happens here in Kristiansand. Up in the Baneheia Lakes, that's the third Stampa, that was used for fire control. They used the water out of that in the city to stop the city fires. But they also put a turbine on the downside of that. And not just here, also in Kystdalen and many other places, they put small hydroelectric plants and they generated power for the cities. So the need to suppress the fire created the ability to create electricity. And we also know that up and down the Setesdals Valley, there are 12 places where the river falls, and now there are 12 big hydroelectric plants. Well, they use the same thing. This is in Telemark. This is the first great big power production plant in Norway. That's Norsk Hydro. They created a lot of electricity, and Sam Ida understood that if he had a lot of electricity and they could bring the bauxite ore, which is what aluminum is made out of, if you brought that bauxite ore from Canada to Kristiansand and you had cheap electricity, you could make cheap aluminum. And that's how that all gets started. Now, in order to get the raw materials here, there has to be a change in the railroads. So we see a change in transport and communications. One more thing that changes here in Norway from 1870 to the beginning of World War I. This is the build-out of this map here shows the build-out of the railroad net in southern Norway. Most important to us here in Kristiansand is the Sørlandsbanen, which is built in stages. Begins here in Kristiansand in 1895. But by it's finished in World War II. But, and we'll get to that later also. But we see all over Norway the growth of the railway net, because you've got to move the raw materials you're producing out to the coast to get them sent out. Now, when you brought them to the coast, then you could put them on steamships. And this is a picture from Arendal in 1848 with a very early steamship, a freighter who could pick up freight and sail anywhere without any concern for what the wind conditions were. So steamships have a huge impact on trading along the coast, because if you're in a sailing ship and you sail into a harbor, it's very hard to get out again. You have to wait until the right wind conditions to get out of the harbor again. So it made sailing ships close in here to the coast hard to use. But when steamships came, it became very easy to pick something up in one little harbor and then sail for example, from Arendal to Kristiansand and around the corner to Mandal and then on. And so the arrival of the steamship made inter-trading and transport inside Norway much easier. Now, if you're going to move things, particularly along a railroad, you have to have very good communications. And that changes when the telegraph arrives. Now, it was easy to put a telegraph up along beside the railroad rails. These guys actually are putting up a telegraph. This is in Sugna, along the coast. They're putting up telegraph poles, which you can see they had to build a base for because it's too hard to dig a hole for. But the telegraph comes and it makes it possible for people to be able to send communications over long distances very quickly. Changes the way that we do business, particularly. The first telegraph in Norway is from Oslo to Drammen, and the first telephone lines also start to show up, and they go from, again, Oslo to Drammen. They're the first one, but the telephone net builds out all over Norway. So we look at those things. We look at the raw materials being used and the easy way to transport them, and the way to organize that transport is with improved communications. And suddenly all these things come together after about 1870, and we see Norway really start to build up. So it's becoming much more industrial important than it had been before, and that's going to have consequences. Now, let's move on to our next theme about this short little lesson, and that's about democracy. Democracy, Norway had home rule since 1814, but it had largely been at the mercy of the Swedes. But beginning in the 1880s, the first political parties start to form in the Storting. They are the Liberals and the Conservatives, and they elect their first prime minister, or he's actually appointed by the king, in 1884. So we have the first parties in 1882, and then the first prime minister in 1884. And he is this guy, Johan Sverdrup. And Johan said, oops. I'm going to tell you what Johan said in just a little bit. Political parties, the first prime minister, we start to get the first legal and political reforms that are by the Norwegian Parliament. They have two official languages, Nynorsk and Bokmål. Trial by jury is brought in, and voting rights first for white males, and then eventually by the beginning of World War I, we see voting for women. It takes quite a few years, but voting rights for people start to come. But most importantly, if you're going to have an industrial economy, you have to have people who can read and write. So in the 1880s, they create 7 years of compulsory, which means required, education. It has a huge impact on the way the country is organized, because now you've got an organized, educated workforce. Okay? So democracy starts to spread. Part of that's going to translate into trade and workers' union. The workers begin to organize themselves. This is a 1st of May celebration. They start to organize in 1870. As a reaction to the growing power of the industries, they feel that they're getting shorted. And you can see here they're marching for 8 hours workday. So workers begin to organize in 1870. So more democracy for everybody, more voting rights, education, and now we get trade and workers' unions that start to develop in the 1870s. So finally, in 1905, Norway became independent from Sweden, and it was almost a non-event. It develops like this. In 1884, the new prime minister said, "All makt I denne sal." All power is in this room, meaning the Storting, meaning that they had the power to control their own country, and that idea starts to spread. So the king's power over the Storting is limited. And the parliamentary democracy that had developed with a prime minister and parties, they take over the rule of the country itself. And in 1905, after many, many years of conflict between the Swedish king, Oscar II, for a lot of very complicated reasons, most of them having to do with taxation, in 1905, the Storting just dissolves the union between Sweden, Unionsupplösning, and that happens on the 7th of July in 1905. They just declare independence. So the king and his advisors had seen this coming for quite a while, and they did not see it as a big problem. They'd already lost most of their influence over things going on in Norway. There was some call for perhaps war against Norway in Sweden, but the king didn't support it. He didn't see any reason to keep Norway underneath Swedish rule. So, but he did ask that the Norwegians, before they could declare their own independence from the Storting, that they have a vote. And so in August of 1905, the Folkeavstemning, they asked the people in Norway, do you want to be independent from Sweden? And they voted overwhelmingly yes to gain independence from Sweden. So in October of 1905 in Karlstad, which is halfway between Oslo and Stockholm in Sweden, Swedish and Norwegian diplomats got together and agreed on separation from Sweden. And Sweden just let the Norwegians go. There was no big dramatic moment as there was in 1814. They just let Norway go. They were done with Norway. At this point, then Norway offers the crown to a Danish prince, Prince Karl, who changes his name to Håkon VII, and he's coronated in June of 1906 as the King of Norway, 22nd of June, 1906. And he will rule Norway until 1957, the beloved Håkon VII. Well, that's a quick look at Norway as it emerges from and as an independent nation at the end of the 19th century due to industrialization, the growth of democracy, and independence from Sweden. All right, thank you very much.